Hello, Eric here. I recently posted a video asking people to submit questions that I could answer. And I came up with a nice long list. And some of them now show up on my chart. I guess this is my possible topic chart. Some haven't made it there yet. So some of those I'll look at it for the future, but some of them were small enough that I thought I could take care of them now, or they were ones where I don't really have a great answer. So I'm going to talk about those now. We're going to call those quick answers, or maybe we're just going to call them lazy answers. They're ones that I can do fairly quickly without doing a ton of research. I will note, answering a question here does not preclude a future in-depth video. There's some topics here that I might spend a whole video on. So if you think I do a crappy job here, let me know, and maybe I'll try to do a less crappy job in a full video in the future. So I pretty much just went verbatim with the way the question was submitted. So here's the first question. How do you see the space economy evolving over the next 50 to 100 years? How does the Earth and Moon and Mars and asteroids and cislunar space factor into this? And this one I thought was a great question that I can answer really easily. I don't know. I think 50 and 100 years is a ridiculously long time span. I just don't see how anybody makes predictions on that span of time. But there is something coming off of here that I'd like to talk about. There's a book from quite a while ago, and a series called The Day the Universe Changed by James Burke. And both the book and the series are very fascinating. One of the things he looks at is what are small sorts of changes that kind of lead to either unexpected things or big changes later on. They lead to what I would call cuspal events or inventions. And those tend to have very big impacts on the world. We're in one of those right now. The global pandemic from COVID. You're going to go look at it and we'll say before COVID, things were this specific way. And after COVID, things are going to be kind of different. And it's really hard when you look at those sort of things to figure out ahead of time what the differences are going to be. You just kind of suspect that there are going to be differences. So, are there any cuspal sort of things in the space economy? Well, I suspect that full reuse is one of those sort of events. The current space economy is built around this assumption that launch is expensive. So all of the businesses, or at least a vast majority of the businesses that both launch satellites, build satellites, do anything like that, assume that launch is expensive. And that's built into the market model. It's kind of built into the companies themselves. Companies are designed to solve a specific problem, and the environment around them is part of that problem. So we've already seen that there's a little disruption around this, just based on what SpaceX did with Falcon 9. Even before they went reusable, there was a lot of disruption because it's a lot cheaper than some of the other alternatives. And then with partial reuse, it's even a little bit cheaper. What I expect to see is that many of the existing companies that we see that are very active and kind of what we would call old space, or what I would call old space, are going to be replaced by new companies. And these new companies are likely to be lean and nimble and be able to take advantage of this new world where launch is just not as expensive. And part of this will be because those old companies aren't paying attention, but a lot of it is just around their structure. They're designed to solve a specific problem, and that problem is not the same. If you look back in the computer world, there used to be companies that made mini computers. And mini computers would be like departmental servers, those sort of things that people connected to with terminals. And there were some very good, very profitable companies that followed that model. And then the personal computer came along. And it's not like those companies didn't see what personal computers were or really think about what might happen from them. They just were not set up structurally to take advantage of that. And the majority of those companies no longer exist. They just aren't in business anymore. So that is what I expect. I expect full reuse is going to be cuspal. I do not know what we're going to end up with on the other side. In those sort of changes, it's a big change and it's very hard to forecast. The other interesting thing about cuspal events is this actually shows up in the biological world. There's a theory called punctuated equilibrium amongst evolution scientists. And basically the theory is things do not change at a constant rate. You see a lot of slow changes that kind of build up. You can think of, we see that in business. And then all of a sudden something big will happen and you'll see big changes over a relative short period of time. Same sort of thing we are seeing here. There's a second thing that gets talked about a lot, and this is kind of the second part of this question. Using resources from space bodies. So using resources from the moon or Mars or asteroids or comets or anything like that. And the question is, how does that tie into things? Is that what I would call cuspal? And I'm pretty skeptical about this. The problem is that getting resources from those space bodies is difficult, both from a technological standpoint and just from a energy standpoint. And that goes specifically against this launch is cheap thing that I think is evolving. If launch is expensive, then maybe it makes sense to try to go to asteroids or somewhere else to get resources and bring it back into the Earth system to use. But if launch is cheap, then you're fighting against that cheap launch. And the real problem about this sort of resource exploitation is if you're going to invest in it, it's going to take a long time. And it's really very likely that along that way, launch is going to get cheaper. And it may turn out that launch is just too cheap. And that thing that you spent several $billion on in 5 or 10 years, suddenly there's no business there anymore. ISRU, in situ resource utilization, which means instead of doing something to take it back, you do something to use it there. So maybe you're trying to find water on the moon, water on Mars, those sorts of things to use for a moon base or a Mars base. This is probably an exception. And the reason it's an exception is that you can make an argument that it's fairly likely that getting the resource locally and processing it might, at least in a longer term, be cheaper than shipping it all the way from Earth. And in fact, SpaceX's Starship plans pretty much require that there be an exception here if you ever want to come back from Mars. So that's that question. Next one. How far do you think we are from in-orbit manufactured spacecraft? And it's an interesting question. My first thought about this is I don't know what manufactured means. Manufactured can be a very long continuum. If you can think at one end, ISS is manufactured. NASA and its partners launched a whole bunch of different modules and they assembled them together. So we can call that manufactured. At the other end, you can think of a world in which you go out and you mine a specific mineral and you refine it to steel, or refine it to iron, make it into steel, convert it into something else and go through a whole step of processes and that's also manufactured. So I don't know really where to draw the line here. In some sense, you can say we're already manufacturing spacecraft. In another sense, you can say we'll probably never manufacture spacecraft. I did come up with a little model that kind of talks, I guess, about the mid-range in between those two. And this is very simple. Cost of spacecraft equals cost of the parts plus the cost of the assembly plus the cost of the launch. And this isn't meant to be rigorous, but just kind of a simple way to think about it. So I did a little table so we could compare the cost based upon what it would take to do it on the ground and what it would take to do it in orbit. And I think the cost of parts, whether you put them together on the ground or whether you put them together in orbit, is probably pretty close. There's a big caveat here. I remember, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, we were installing a dishwasher in our first house. And because the installation was weird and I didn't know that much about plumbing, it took me 4 trips to the home store to get all the parts I needed to finish the installation. That would be not a big problem if you're on the ground. You're making a spacecraft on the ground. You can just get out your McMaster catalog and look through and say, yeah, we need these parts instead of the ones we currently have. In orbit, that is much more of a big deal. So if in orbit, if you have broken or missing or inappropriate parts, you are probably stuck. Unless you get lucky. You have to have some way of getting those parts up. So I'm saying 1-to-1 here. In orbit can be a whole lot worse. Cost of assembly. So the thing about the ground is there is this incredible amount of infrastructure built that makes it easy for you to do things. If you have, just to pick an example, if you have something electronic you want to make, you can do the design and you can send it off to someone else. And in 3 or 4 days, they will give you the design back, with parts and operating and tested. And if you build a module, you can go through and you can test everything to every extent that you want to. And that's simple. You're on the ground and you can call people. You can bring in people that are specifically good at a specific kind of testing. It's very easy. On orbit, you need to get people there that can do assembly or come up with some robotic way to do assembly. You have to figure out how to test things, and you need to do it with a small amount of resources. And like parts, if your testing isn't great or things like that, it is problematic. I say that it's 10 times as hard. I think it might even be higher. There's one thing that we've learned from watching ISS. ISS barely assembled on orbit. Almost everything is on the ground and tested on the ground. And it takes a lot of astronaut time to keep ISS functioning. And that's just functional. That's not building and adding new things. Cost of launch, I'm going to say cost of launch is about the same. You're really getting the same things into orbit. So what does that give us total? So ground 3, in orbit 12. So I'm saying 4-to-1. I don't think we actually really know what in orbit is like because we haven't tried to do things that I would call hard things in orbit for the most part. So how far do I think we are from in-orbit manufactured spacecraft? Anything that's other than pretty simple assembly, I think we are a long ways from that. I think all of the incentives are to do as much on ground as you can and then launch the thing versus trying to get cute and do lots of work in orbit. There's one little caveat here. I have a little thing on cost of launch. It's possible you can think of a world in which maybe the resources are cheaper to get. Maybe they're cheaper to get from the moon than from the ground. I think that's unlikely, but you can think of a world at some time where that might be true. And if that starts getting true, maybe in orbit looks a little more interesting. But wow, there is just so much infrastructure on the ground, and there right now is none, really, from a manufacturing standpoint. Next question, and this is kind of related. Best path for large orbital stations. Just a Starship with access ports to the empty tanks, inflatable modules, conventional aluminum steel bodies transported by Starship, or something else. And this one it does align with the last one. So basically what you're saying is the first one is kind of like this. So this is a space shuttle hydrogen tank. So this is in the external tank. It's the hydrogen part. And this is kind of roughly what you'd see in the tanks of Starship. So you have something like that. Inflatable. This is the Bigelow expandable module attached to the space station. And the problem we have with both of these is they are mostly empty space. The propellant tank is fully empty space. The Bigelow is empty space, except for the stuff you see on the far bulkhead is what was used to expand it and inflate it. And the question is, if you have these sort of spaces, how do you take them to something like this? And this is the interior of Skylab. So Skylab was built into a Saturn V third stage tank and launched like that. No propellant, just the empty tank. So the real question is, how do you get from one of those two to one of the others? And I think what that means is you need to lift a lot of material, because you need to set up at the very, very minimum, you need lighting, you need temperature control. Like in SpaceX, it's like if you look at the Starship, none of those tanks have temperature control. You need something on the outside or something on the inside to give you temperature control. Heating, ventilation, all of those sorts of things, fire suppression, fire identification, all of those things that you would find in a space station module, you have to somehow figure out how to retrofit into these empty spaces. And this goes back to the same point I made before. Doing this sort of thing on the ground is going to be a lot easier than doing it in orbit. Probably an order of magnitude easier. And it's kind of interesting. So Skylab actually did, so the Saturn V stage had two tanks in it, had an oxygen tank and a hydrogen tank. And they did use the second tank. The laboratory was in one tank. They used the second tank, but they used it just to hold trash. That was a good use for the empty tank, but I don't think that's what people are really advocating for here. So that's what I think about those two sorts of approaches. The specific question talks about a Starship with access ports, and I'm going to modify this. So compare this to a Starship where you build out the inside of Starship so it becomes an orbital station, versus lifting up a Starship, lifting up a module, orbital station module inside Starship. And I think by far the second is a more likely scenario. It's just a better scenario. You think I can anywhere in the country, I can create a place where I'm going to build this module, and then I just need to ship it wherever Starship launches from. And do that, and Starship presumably will be optimized, like all other launchers are, for this easy thing of just bringing a payload in, integrating it, and launching it. If you're trying to build a Starship that is part Starship and I guess part orbital station, then you need to have access at the manufacturing standpoint when they're building the Starship, or after they've built it, to clean it up and do whatever you want and do all that retrofitting. And then you're limited, of course, by the size of the Starship. And to me, that just seems much less interesting. There are a lot more constraints there. So best path, yeah, kind of the traditional approach is what I'm thinking. Next, do water-based nuclear thermal rockets, rocket-propelled vehicles, make sense as a higher flight rate option for surface-to-orbit vehicles at ice-rich moons compared to Hydrolox ISRU-propelled vehicles? Okay, this is pretty complex. Let's see if I can break it down. So the scenario is you're somewhere where you can extract ice, water ice, and do something with it. Now, maybe it's a moon, maybe it's Mars, I don't know what sort of place. And the idea is that if you did a conventional rocket, you would take that, you would break the water apart, presumably electrically, you would store the resulting hydrogen and oxygen, liquefy it, you get hydrolox, and you run a conventional engine off of that. So that's kind of the scenario. The second scenario is you have a nuclear thermal rocket and you use water as a propellant in that rocket. Well, the first thing I need to do is link to my video on building a nuclear nuclear tug. It talks a lot about what the structure of these vehicles are and how those things work, etc. You'll probably find if you watch that I'm reasonably skeptical about this being a useful thing in general. Nuclear engines, nuclear rockets, are a lot like aerospike engines. You'll find lots of people who talk about how great they are, but nobody has actually thought they were good enough to actually build and fly one. The U.S. in nuclear thermal rockets, the U.S. did research. The Russians, I think, did a little research. But even the Russians these days, they have lots of uranium, and they don't have U.S. environmental laws, so they could actually test these things pretty easily. And they've chosen not to. And to me, that's a fairly good indication that they aren't very excited about them either. So, to talk about this specific scenario, I need to get in a little bit to the details. So this is a typical design for a nuclear thermal rocket. On the left, somewhere, you have a big tank of liquid hydrogen. It gets fed in through turbopumps into your reactor core, and it flows through channels. And the liquid hydrogen gets converted to gaseous hydrogen, gets really hot, and comes out of the nozzle. And that is how things basically work. So if you do this, you get a very high ISP. And another link here, this is going to be a link to my video on specific impulse where we talk about ISP and what it means. If you don't want to go watch that, it basically means you're very efficient. It doesn't take a lot of propellant to get a given effect. So that's what you have here. And the question is, would it be better, instead of running hydrogen through your engine, to run water? And I went and searched this actually a fair bit. I had to find some references. This isn't very critically studied, but the references I found said that with water, you're going to get an ISP of about 410, which is not terribly exciting compared to what you would get with chemical fuels. So if you had gone to liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, and you burn those in a conventional engine, you can get about 450. And that's a nice light conventional engine. This water-fueled nuclear rocket would be much heavier, the engine part. So that alone doesn't look very exciting to me. There are some further issues. One of the complex things, well, this is true with chemical rockets. Chemical rockets, you design an engine for a specific fuel. And you can't just switch and say, oh, this same engine, I want to, instead of liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, I want to use liquid methane. It just doesn't work that way. So, oh, I'm sorry, I have a cat in the room. So you would have to design your system here, your thermal rocket, to work on water. And water is actually a bit problematic here. Going to bring water in. Well, first you have to keep it liquid, which is kind of challenging in space, but let's assume you can do that. You keep the water liquid, you inject it into the reactor core, and what happens? Well, it converts to steam, and it converts to very hot steam. Well, it turns out that very hot steam is very corrosive. And you're going to have to figure out how to build your core so that this very hot steam does not abrade away abrade away things in your core, erode away, and cause things to break apart or melt down, or all the things that can happen in this nuclear thermal rocket. So to me, that just doesn't look very exciting, that as a fuel. There is another option that I thought I'd talk about. Isn't quite what the original person asked, but there's this interesting theoretical design called LANTR. And basically this starts with a normal hydrogen mode nuclear thermal rocket. So you send hydrogen through, it goes through the reactor core, it comes out, and it works just the way you would expect. And it gives you the ISP of 900. So really nice and efficient for that. There's another mode. The LA in LANTR stands for LOX augmented. And basically what is done is the LOX that you carry along is injected into the nozzle. So you get hot hydrogen out of the reactor core, and then you inject LOX and you burn it. So you kind of get the advantage of kind of a chemical hydrolox engine at the end of your reactor. And the big advantage of this, the ISP still goes down because your exhaust is water rather than just pure hydrogen. But you get a lot more thrust because you're just burning a lot more. Instead of just the heat, you have the heat that comes out of burning hydrogen and oxygen. And I think if you're in a place where you have lots of water, especially if you're already going to be converting it to hydrogen and oxygen, this probably makes more sense than a water mode approach because it gives you that higher thrust, and higher thrust is useful in a lot of cases. So that's what I think about this. As I've said in the past, I'm really not very hot on nuclear thermal rockets. I just don't think I don't think they really give you the things that are important. Next question. How much will landing NASA astronauts on Mars cost the government? Well, this is like the first question. I really don't have any idea. There are so many variables here that it's very hard to come up with even a ballpark sort of figure. But I did decide, how could I provide something useful rather than just saying I don't know. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a bunch of different estimates. And all of these are in 2020 dollars. So if something was done back in the 60s, rather than using their actual number, I'll convert it based on inflation to what we expect it would be, in 2020. I'm going to start with Apollo. Apollo in 2020 dollars was about 280 billion, somewhere in that range, which seems like, wow, that seems like a lot of money. Now that got us Mercury and Gemini and Apollo and a whole bunch of tracking stations and all of this other stuff. But yeah, that's a fair bit of money. In 1990, there was this thing called the Space Exploration Initiative, which basically said, what would NASA do if they were not budget constrained? So they came up, one of the things they talked about was a Mars landing. And the overall ticket for this initiative, which included Mars but had other things in it too, $945 billion over the 20-30 years. 2005, we had a repeat of the go out and look what you would like to do if you had unlimited money. This was called the Vision for Space Exploration. They said $300 billion. That included Mars plus some other things. This also gave us the start of Constellation, the Ares 1, Ares 5 rocket, and the Ares 5 morphed into SLS in about 2010. So, what else? 2009, I really like this one, the NASA Austere Human Mission to Mars. Austere just means minimal or cheap or something like that. They said only 91 billion, so I guess compared to the others, it is pretty cheap. That still seems like a whole lot of money. I went looking for some current stuff. So NASA has this current thing, which I think they call Journey to Mars or the Moon to Mars program, kind of these two together. I went out and looked for numeric, cost estimates. I actually didn't find any, but I'm sure it's going to just be great. Everyone seems very excited about it. So we saw everything from 91 billion to 945 billion. Some of those were just Mars. Some of those were just other things. So much of this depends upon the underlying infrastructure, how hard it is to get into orbit. If you're going based on what exists now, what NASA has now, or very near term, it's going to be very expensive. If you hope that SpaceX's Starship gets there and things get a lot cheaper, it will get less expensive. But note that SpaceX building Starship to go to the moon twice, 2 different pieces, is about $3 billion. And you can expect that going to Mars is a lot more complicated. So if I had to choose a number for, I would say 30 billion seems cheap to me. Mars is hard to get to. That's if NASA's doing it. If SpaceX by themselves is doing it, maybe it could be quite a bit cheaper. But that's about all the information I have about this, or all I'm willing to say. What do you think about that whole Starbase EIS controversy? EIS, environmental impact statement. And I already put up what I think about it. And there's an old saying, I don't know if it's actually Sicilian, you can't fight City Hall. And basically what that is saying is when you are a company or a person trying to do something, there are a lot of things you can just throw money at. So we've seen SpaceX throw money at a ton of things. They throw money at building a lot of excess hardware at Boca Chica. They throw money at, building new construction things, building bays, renting cranes. They put a lot of money into trying to be quick and fast and efficient. And then you run up against things like EIS that have very specific requirements and processes, and guess what? You can't throw money at them anymore. You're just kind of stuck. And that's pretty much what state we are in right now. And I'm not sure what the original poster meant by controversy. There's certainly a lot of talk about this, and that the FAA should do things differently, and that it's all set up, and all of these things. Lots of opinions all over the place. I think mostly the controversy is just there because people want things to talk about, and because we're waiting for this, there isn't anything more exciting to talk about. Beyond that, I just don't think there's a lot of fire. Now, my expectation is that there are really 3 things that could come out. The determination could be SpaceX is just fine, go off and launch. And that's one thing, or it might be SpaceX is fine, but you need to change some small things. Or it could be, you guys are doing a big different thing, and you have to go through a much larger process. This current one, is really a modification of an EIS they did in the past. And, the government could come and say, you need to start over. And that would be a big, big deal in terms of time. What do I expect? Well, I'm not great at predicting this, but I expect it'll be one of the first 2. I just do not expect, given what they've asked and what they have in the past, I don't expect it to be a major impediment other than a time perspective, which we've already seen. And those are the questions that I thought I had quick answers to. You can look for answers to some of the other questions that got asked when I get around to it. Thank you for your attention, and please subscribe.